here for this special event on the living legacy of John Urry's work, organised by my colleague Rodanti Zanelli. And I'll hand over to Rodanti in a moment to do the full introduction, and she'll also be introducing our speakers. But I did want to say Rodanti, I'm sure, is very familiar to many of you, but is a associate professor of cultural sociology at the University of Leeds, and a prolific author in the field of mobilities and its connections to globalization, cosmopolitanism, tourism, and large-scale film events and culture globally. We've had a couple of some events on Rodanti's work last year, on her books on frictions in cosmopolitan mobilities and magical realist sociologies, which you can still find on the Bauman Institute website. And I'm very pleased that we have this program of mobilities events this year that Rodanti's organised. It's a major stream within the Bauman Institute, and this year Rodanti's really been able to develop a full program of reflection on the field of mobilities. I don't want to say too much. I did want to say one or two words about John Urry. I feel a lot about John Urry as I do about Zygmunt Bauman, in a sense that they're both major theoretical figures that I didn't know personally, and wish I had known them personally, given much of what I've learned, I think, over recent years about the personal influence of these scholars on people, and their the immense influence they've had intellectually on so many people. And John Urry's work obviously has become a key work for understanding as a whole developments in critical theory and thinking in the broad sphere of globalization, I think, in the last over a number of decades. And we're obviously here to explore all of that today. I'm a kind of critic of John Urry in a sense. And I remember I wrote a book review of Sociology Beyond Societies when that came out around 2000. But one thing that was obvious about that book was that it was a paradigm shifter. It was a massive book in terms of its obvious impact in shifting research well beyond the direct field of mobilities that it came out of. And I think that has certainly proven to be the case. We've seen how it's substantially shifted so many people's work, including my own, I think, as a result of its impact at that time. And of course, there's work both before and after that should be thought of in the same light. So I'm really excited to listen and learn today from the scholars that we've put together in the program, and many of whom are friends of the Bauman Institute, and very, very glad that we have this set of events coming up this year, and this wonderful first event to launch it. So I'll hand over to Rodanti, and thank you very much, Rodanti, for putting together this event. And it's an exciting day for us at the Institute. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Adrian. I'm going to try to share something. If I can. My computer. Okay. I am not sure if this is visible. Is it?
It's okay. Yes, we're seeing the PowerPoint with the side panel as well. That's
okay.
It. Oh, it's the full thing. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So thank you very much, Adrian, for introducing me. So I will skip that and just say that my acquaintance with John was based on pure accident. Well, I generated the accident, but at the same time, it was because I was reading various things. I was coming from history, and I was a postgraduate research student in the Department of History at Lancaster. And I started changing my mind as to what I wanted to be. And John was one of the first kind of points of contact. And he kindly actually accepted me one day when I wanted to see him. And we started talking about things such as Foucault, categories of identity. And that was one of the things that really influenced me subsequently. And I ended up finally working on ideas of accident, serendipity, and travel. That was back in the spring of 2001. So here's my personal angle to this event that I organized. And this was organized under the auspices of the Bauman Institute in collaboration with the Center for Mobilities Research at Lancaster. Our gathering is meant as a celebration of fellowship in mobilities, theory, and practice. In no likelihood, John would have imagined this as open and in flux. Another anecdote here, the term legacy that I use in this title connects to John's succinct endorsement of one of my books, Heritage in the Digital Era. And they argued that in our mobile world, cultural industry professionals build their own communities outside the auspices of ethno-national heritage. And they make unwritten and written rules. I summed up under the term legacy rather than heritage. And in his endorsement, actually, he reflected that I analyze how cinematic, tourist, and political mobilities are complexly intertwined within the digital era. And I was perplexed because I thought, hey, where is the politics here? So much I knew. In many respects, what we do today is far more refined than what I was doing in that book, which I considered with naivety as an apolitical, light version of popular culture. Our three presenters today bring center stage their own take on some of the key aspects of the mobilities agenda. It's not just about John Urry, it's about the mobilities agenda. Really, we are going to talk about. So if anyone expects to learn specifically about how John Urry developed the paradigm, you may be a little bit disappointed. Apologies for that. A simple repetition, though, of John's work would do injustice both to his notion of critical social analysis and the three speakers' own quite sophisticated take on his work, and what mobilities are as a social kind of a set of social phenomena, as well as how they affect contemporary societies, cultures, ecologies, and environments. I find it impossible really to summarize effectively his intellectual contribution to sociology and beyond. I will try to do a bit of this because I'm supposed to do it. This is my role really in this program. The tourist gaze thesis is often cited as one of his major critical innovations. But if one concentrates exclusively on tourism and travel, they only scratch the surface of his mobilities philosophy of social science. In fact, if you consider John's subsequent collaborative pursuits on tourism with colleagues such as Michael Haldrup, Ole Berenhout, Jonas Larsen, Kevin Hannam, and Michelle, among others, you identify elements of all these colleagues' subsequent turn to network, complexity, system theory. But it was a dialogue, really, not a monologue crafted by John. An emphasis on urban battles between microcosmic mobilities and the systemic industrial control of human life works was also featured in the trajectories of all these scholars as a dialogue with a friend. Battles for community and environmental justice are also part of what they currently work on, and there will be a lot of this today. Broadly speaking, such battles have been explored in Lefebvrean terms in relation to change of exchange. This is why both John and the Global Mobilities Network are so much more than a realist and Althusserian community, as some esteemed colleagues actually argued recently. I've been reading some reflections on John and the mobilities paradigm, and I think I find a slight misunderstanding there of what the mobilities paradigm is about. Anyone who associates themselves with Deleuze and Guattari's work is bound to find themselves between phenomena of knowing about the social and becoming in social contexts. And I actually believe that John's philosophy of movement carried this ambiguity, and this became more prominent in the last 6 or so years of his career and life in his publications. Perhaps we can discuss about it later, but it also endorsed a study of the ambivalence carried within academic analysis on and representations of the disenfranchised or those affected by inequalities more and more, especially when he shifted emphasis on the environment, climate crisis, and so on and so forth. And it is no wonder that Bauman's ethical-political philosophy was cited so many times in his work, especially his earlier work. And one of the most cited references have come from, it has to do with Bauman's globalization book, which is one of the most cited and read. The Stranger and the Migrant were always there. The Eric Bauman voice about them still drives the work of other mobility scholars. I found it when I was reading the work that Ole Jensen currently produces on dark design, and Malene Fodendal Peterson's work on ethics is driven by Bauman's and Eric's work. But this nestling between knowing and being or becoming guides actually one of our speakers today, incorporation of digitality into its mobilities and the production of hospitality networks, Jennie Germann Molz research. And such research is on much more again than tourism. It teaches us that the virtual produces ephemeral communities, but also reaffirms all forms of association rooted in soil and bordered identities. Although an interpretation of John's work, which I share with her, I have to say, this more than tourism statement suggests that John was concerned not just with epistemologies, but also ontologies, how citizenships, nations, and professional identities are formed, not just how we study them. And this is not pure Marx, who was constantly cited by John Urry, or Wallerstein, or Tusser, but also in a kind of mix, Derrida and Bauman. Because in mobilities theory, purposive movements involve both animate and inanimate actants, so we move past classical sociology into actor network theory. Because of that, and would become pragmatically, I would say, networked in small micro and mesocontext, regional analysis has been very important for the mobilities paradigm at large, and ethnographic research, hands-on. The city as a microcosm is such a case in point, both in John's work and generally mobility scholars' work. It is significant that John's original research interests were not associated with systems or practices of leisure movement, but the political sociology of power. I therefore stood corrected by his endorsement when he claimed that I actually think about the politics of culture. In some respects, I was also inflecting aspects of his work, I have to say. Today, very few connect John's Michael Molz on mobilities to his early monograph. I think it was the first one or the second one, Reference Groups and the Theory of Revolution. And yet his subsequent Mobilities Manifesto in Sociology Beyond Societies, which is the Mobilities Manifesto, refined aspects of his early work on the Enlightenment, industrial decline, and the language of revolutionary action. John's call to receive a commitment, to revive a commitment to, and I quote from Sociology Beyond Societies, one or more of the key social movements of the working class, trade unions, professional managerial classes, urban, women's, LGBT, environmentalist groups is revived and creatively revised in Mimi Scheller's and Michael Haldrup's presentations today. There is no time or space to get into great detail on the mobilities paradigm's programmatic statement as a whole. Today, the symposium proves that the paradigm moves as we speak, because its intellectual community moves, and moves it as a conceptual formation, and does so with new technologies. So without further delay, I will introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Michael Haldrup. He's Professor of Performance Design at Roskilde University. His research interests involve performance, design, and ontologies relating to the role of materiality and practice-based embodied knowledge. His current research agenda focuses on futuring, speculative ontologies, and utopian theory in relation to experimental and explorative approaches to research design, teaching, and activism. He has co-authored numerous publications with mobilities colleagues, including Performing Tourist Places with Ole Berholt, John Urry, and Jonas Larsen, and Tourism, Performance, and the Everyday Life with Jonas Larsen. That's one of my favorite. His more recent collaborative volume published research, Experimental Museology, Institutions, Representations, Users, was co-edited with Maria Meckham and Christine Drobner. Reflecting on John Urry's experiment and engagement in setting a new agenda for reclaiming the future for the social sciences, Michael will discuss the themes of global complexities and mobilities. These were central strands in John's thinking as a still relevant resource for understanding the planet as an emergent category and planetarianism as a transdisciplinary call for action and thought. And I look forward to this. Vested interest. I want to know what you think about all this, Michael. Mimi Scheller is one of the leading figures in mobility scholarship. She is currently Dean of the Global School at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts. From 2009 to 2021, she was Professor of Sociology in the Department of Culture and Communication and founding director of the new Mobilities Research and Policy Center at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Mimi was one of the engineers of the paradigm at Lancaster and co-founding editor of the journal Mobilities. In her early career, she became known for her award-winning first book, Democracy After Slavery, Black Publics and Peasant Radicalism in Haiti and Jamaica, and her second book, Consuming the Caribbean, From Arawaks to Zombies, which I really like. I cannot provide a detailed list of Mimi's numerous contributions to the discipline of sociology, geography, and now also politics, and I would say generally policy. She's on the editorial board of several journals. Her more recent research focuses on mobilities justice, and this is also the title of her recent book, which focuses on the power and inequality, on how power and inequality inform the governance and control of movement in the era of climate change and extreme urbanization. Today, Mimi prompts us to think critically about the crisis of knowledge. Let me shift. Drawing on John's work, she suggests that the new mobilities paradigm is as much a style of thought and practice as it's a field of inquiry. She will explain why thinking as a mobile scholar at a time when universities, higher education, and intellectual inquiry are under immense pressure to be cost-effective, relevant, innovative, and agile. Jennie Molz's presentation on the nature of the mobile imagination as an aspect of the sociological imagination is the perfect conclusion to the main part of the symposium. Jennie is currently Professor of Sociology at the College of the Holy Cross in Massachusetts. She is a well-known scholar of mobilities theory who published extensively on topics such as tourism, mobility, hospitality, globalization, cosmopolitanism, and new technologies. Her ongoing research focuses on the social and civic implications of tourism, mobilities, and technology. She is co-editor of Mobilized and Hospitality, and also co-editor of the journal Hospitality and Society. Her major publications include Travel Connections, Technology, Tourism, and Togetherness in a Mobile World with Roskilde, and Disruptive Tourism and its Untidy Guests, Alternative Ontologies for Future Hospitalities with Palgrave Macmillan, which is a creative take on hospitality that she authored with another 4 scholars. The World is Our Classroom, Extreme Paradigm and the Rise of World Schooling, this quite intimidating title, was published this year with New York University Press, and it's his latest monograph on yet another innovative topic, the uses of mobile lifestyle as a form of parenting. And Jennie was actually interviewed by Northern Notes, which is the blog of the School of Sociology and Social Policy at Leeds this year. And you can access her interview, the interview online, if you will. Jennie suggests that John has challenged the strongholds of the sociological imagination, and I agree with her. I would also add that it is both a tall order and a pleasure for us as his interlocutors, mentees, and friends to continue to do the work of reimagining sociology and its relationship with other disciplines. I always saw in John's work the signature of an imaginative engineer of ideas as practice, synthesizing from existing traditions to talk about a world or several constellations of sociocultural worlds in flux. So before we open the floor to the audience, we will listen to some reflections on today's presentations from two, and I hope that both of them are here already. Two of John's close scholarly and institutional collaborators. The first one is James Faulconbridge, professor at the Management School in Lancaster and Associate Director of CEMORE, which is one of John's institutional legacies at Lancaster University. James works on communities of practice and theories of knowledge and learning in organizations. And it's a pleasure to have his input as his interdisciplinary portfolio adds a new dimension to the discussion on what mobilities theory and practice are about. And the second one is Jonas Larsen, and a close collaborator and friend of John's. He's professor of mobility and urban studies at Roskilde University, with a long-standing interest in tourist photography, tourism, and mobility. His work has been translated in several languages, and he is on the editorial board of Mobilities, tourist studies, and photographies. More recently, Jonas has written extensively about urban cycling and running, and he has also just published a book on urban marathons with Routledge under the title Urban Marathons, Rhythms, Places, Mobilities, that received a lot of likes on Facebook. Jonas is the key academic expert in a big new research project on urban walkability and new methods. And with this, I think I would pass the discussion on to our first presenter, who is Michael. Michael, it's your turn.
I will just start sharing here.
Yeah.
Great. Do you see my screen? Because I have
yeah. Yeah, we can.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for the invitation, Rodandi, to speak at this event on the living legacy of John Urry. As I also wrote to you, I was initially a bit puzzled by the invitation, as I do not really, to be honest, identify much with the field of sociology or the mobilities paradigm as such today, although I appreciate the work done by mobility scholar and the mobility scholars for bringing about some of the most important concerns and themes for us as planetary citizens today, especially perhaps the work of our two other speakers today, the work on intersectional mobilities by Mimi Scheller and the work of the on the relationship between cosmobility, embodiment, and travel by Jennie Germann Molz. However, Rodandi persuaded me with giving me the image on having been on a journey that I perhaps started with John and completed on my own. I don't really know how much I feel myself alone today, but perhaps in the company of other travel companions. And I don't either know if the travel is complete as by now, but let's get started. My title today is, of course, paraphrasing what I think is John's last published book, What is the Future?, in which he discusses a program for reclaiming the future, as Rodandi was also referring to. And in this talk, I will try to give some perspectives on that by taking an outset in his notion of futurity in the book, and related to some of the more recent discussion on the planet as an increasingly important category and analytical frame in the humanities and social science, perhaps best advocated by Deepesh Chakrabarty, that I will return to. And I will consider the relationship between the planetary, the theme of the planetary, and the theme of futurity. And after a short bridge, I will try to discuss what kind of futures we might imagine if we kind of decenter the perspective from a sociological and human perspective and imagine a future where there's also the place and space for the coexistence of non-human others. In that, I will relate to some of the concerns in John's work that goes back to the 1990s about globalization and citizenship, and try to relate that to current discussions on planetarianism and citizenship. The starting point for what is the future is a historical observation of the fact that studies of alternative futures that emerged over the past 70 years were mainly developed outside social science and developed as a specialized and increasingly professionalized discipline, generating its own journals, key books, iconic figures, global bodies, professional organizations, and founding texts. An observation that also explain the fact that we being decision makers, politicians, journalists, look for advice on the past and present. When we look for advice on the past and present, we look for trained academics at the universities. But when we look for advice on the future, we look to privately funded think tanks, corporate business leaders, etc. A fact that at once hides and illustrates the ideological nature of future studies and the reason why it needs to be reclaimed by social science and used to empower people in their everyday life. So what is the future in central ways summarizes a concern that flavors much of John Urry's production in his last 10 years as a prolific commentator and writer, especially browsing through his various books on climate politics and the need to shift to another societal paradigm than once based on the consumption of fossil-based fuels. We see also an atmosphere of frustration in the texts with a societal lack of ability to enable such a transformation. I think I'm just mentioning it because what is the future, of course, must be seen within the context of several other publications from his hand, as well as his involvement with establishing the Lancaster Institute of Social Futures, but other people here might be better equipped to make the latter connection. In that sense, What is the Future is not a standalone book, but a book that needs to be seen in relation to very specific concerns that emerged not only in John Urry's mind, but more broadly in these years. If you went to an academic bookshop in the decade between 2010 and 20, John Urry's book was certainly not the only one concerned with the future. You would find a wide range of books from a wide range of disciplines and perspectives on exactly this issue. Here I'm just referring design theoretician Tony Fry, who was one of the first in the wave with his book on futuring from 2009. Quickly followed, in addition to John Urry's work, by Arjun Abadurai's book on the future as cultural fact, Mark O'Shea, and former Silicon Valley guru Jaron Lanier, inventor of virtual reality, and his high-pitched whistleblowing warning against how the high-tech industries was already stealing our future from us. All books that shares a concern and a program for reclaiming the future. As Italian philosopher and collaborator with Tony Negri, Franco Berardi observed in these years, this wave broke in the same moment as the future was basically becoming unimaginable by most people, movements, and politicians, as anything else than a continuation of the current catastrophic course. A similar observation that was also made by Naomi Klein and followed these years by her in numerous presentations. And I'm just mentioning this because I know that Naomi Klein was to a large extent a figure that also inspired John's work on this. So my point is not to say that John Urry's book is not to say that John Urry's book was just a part of a general trend and therefore trivial, rather the opposite. Situating his work within this context, I think demonstrate how engaged he was in the most significant struggle of this planet. In making the observation that reclaiming the future was not an easy task, John Urry in many ways echoed a general mood that we also see in relation to progressive politics and progressive academia and activism more generally also in these years. This photo shows a recent manifestation by the Copenhagen faction of Extinction Rebellion over the last perhaps 5-6 years from around the time when John's book emerged. We have seen that sort of manifestations around the planet, and I think that it's thought-provoking here that a common theme in many of these manifestations play on a speculative imagination of a planet without humans and probably also without social science and humanities as we know it. In the book, What is the Future? John Urry, despite this frustration or with the potential for reclaiming the future, lists a couple of ideas to how to reclaim the future methods. One is learning from past visions of the future, 2, studying failed futures, 3, developing dystopic thought, 4, utopias. And we should note here with this context we have today that he's actually referring directly to Bauman's concept of active utopias as the production of alternatives in everyday life and everyday politics, 5, extrapolating existing trends, and 6, scenario building. But apart from this list, there's not much optimism to see. To the contrary, he actually argues in the conclusion chapter that futures are never wholly open, although there are moments of greater openness when the die seems less cast, such as around 1970. And I think that this formulation makes it quite clear that in his perspective, there were not many reasons to be happy with the current state of the planetary future in the years of writing here, 2015 to 16. As I said before, I think that John Urry here captures a general mood about can we at all see a future, or is the future horizon simply vanishing before our eyes? And in what I'm going to argue in what comes now, I want to kind of discuss whether this might be related to a certain conception of the future as based on an anthropocentric perspective. Hence, I want critically but constructively to raise the question from which perspective the issue of the what is of the future is raised in John's work. That is, who are we who might or might not have a future? Notions of planetarianism emerged as an alternative to the image of the globe towards the end of the 20th century, arriving from 2 very different sources. First, environmental activism and didactics as a call of attention to local ecologies and systems and their degradation. And secondly, within academia, through Gayatri Spivak's work, where the planetarian perspective were presented as a non-totalitarian and relational alternative to the totalizing forces and implications of the globalization, both as a force, a process, and an academic concept. More recently, it has made its way over philosophy, design, social science, politics, and the humanities as a starting point for corrective or alternative to ideas of cosmopolitanism, transnationalism, and globalism, whether thematized as something that emerges as part of an epochal shift in the relation between humans and the earthly ecologies, such as Timothy Morton argues, an entry into a new epoch of planetary conflicts, as the way Bruno Latour recently have emphasized it, the registration of the current state of affair as a global terror site, as design scholar Arturo Escobar says, or as a set of new potentials for planetary technical solutions to our common problems: global governance, social technological terraforming strategies as proposed by Benjamin Bratton of the Strelka Institute. In all these kind of discussions, both academic and more political, the planet has become a central category and analytical frame for the humanities and for social science, as Deepa Chakrabarty has argued in an article in 2019 that I recommend very much, on the emergence of the planet as a category. And here I want to dwell a bit with Deepa Chakrabarty's suggestion for reimagining the planet as an outset for formulating ethics and actions. Or what we could say, his answer to Spivak's formulation as what she regards as the imperative to reimagine the planet. Chakrabarty develops his notion of planetarianism at quite some length in an article published in Critical Inquiry in late 2019. And his outset is a distinction between 4 different conceptions of the celestial body we live on. With the risk of reducing his argument here, he observes that while the 3 classical ways of thinking the extent of this celestial body, each has humans at the center. The world as known human society, the earth as the ecosystem that bears it, and the globe as an expansion of institutions and technologies that establishes a complex technological network that enables a process we know as globalization. To this, he adds a 4th empirical emerging category, the planet, a category that we simply more and more are confronted with when we, so to speak, reach the boundaries of globalization, when we extract in parts of the world where we haven't been extracted before, where we are confronted with disaster, the consequences of resource extraction, degradations of the environment caused by our ways of living globally. An obvious example is, of course, climate change that John was dealing or addressing a lot. A more recent example is that the pandemic that we have all had as a kind of planetary context for our work and life the last 1.5 years probably also have been developed, like many other viral infections, because humans more often than earlier get into contact with strange new mutating infectants through the places they live and in the ways that they consume. I will not replicate all of his arguments here, but I think that he poses a challenge to the way we talk and think about human life, and also the perspectives and the horizons for thinking about futures in relation to the planet. So with this rather long quote, I want to note a couple of points. Firstly, Chakrabarty notes that the key term in planetary thinking that one could contrapose to the idea of sustainability in global thought is habitability. Habitability does not reference humans. Its central concern is life, complex multicellular life in general, and what makes that not humans alone sustainable. That is, he proposes a shift in focus from asking about the sustainability of our complex networks and the way the feedback mechanisms with our resources extraction and ecosystem works. He asks for a shift in focus to the question of habitability rather than sustainability of the systems. Secondly, he notes that the problem of habitability should not be distinguished from the discussion on life that has gone on in the humanities, should be distinguished from the discussion on life that has gone on in the humanities under a rubric of biopolitics. The question at the center is not what life is or how it is managed in the interest of power, but rather what makes the planet friendly to the continuous existence of complex life. That is, displacing the perspective from how life, bodies, bacteria, resources are managed and the power relations and problems related with this, but rather to make the planet friendly to complex life. And here comes the central point in Chakrabarty's perspective. The immediately relevant point is that humans are not central to the problem of habitability, but habitability is central to human existence If the planet were not habitable for complex life, we simply would not be here. That is, not only should we displace a perspective on how we, the human species, manages life processes, but entirely decenter the focus from our particular species, from our analytical concern. Although we might have a private interest in that the planet is also habitable for Homo sapiens, we are not necessarily preconditions for the habitability of this planet as such. It might be better off with us, as he formulates it in another place. The earth has mercy, the planet is indifferent. So, addressing potential human futures, we have to reimagine the planet on which it unfolds. This is what Latour and others have called a politics for landing on Earth. While not enough, a starting point could be an ethical commitment to develop what Jane Bennett have called an everyday tactics for cultivating an ability to discern the vitality of matter. An ethical this is also a central point in Latour and Weibel's, and it's their book that I'm quoting here, recent book or catalogue of an imagined exhibition, Critical Zones. We have, as Latour has stated elsewhere, to exchange the canonical image of the Earth, the iconic blue marble state seen from away, symbolizing an ideal of global governance, for something more realistic and appropriate for the contemporary moment. To do this, they suggest to work with fiction in addition to science, with the purpose of opening a fictional space to explore life, to create disorientation, and in turn enable an imagination realistic enough to follow what the world is made up and how, hence use aesthetics and fictionings to produce more realistic and appropriate potentials for sensing our planet in its current state, not less. A great example that could illustrate this is this recent illustration by Superflux and Anna Bjain at the Venice Biennale, a speculative invitation for free surviving humans to take part in a banquet. I find it quite relevant for thinking about the ethics of futurity and planetarianism, but Latour and Weibel want us to take one step further and reimagine our positionality with regards to the planet as an orienting device for landing on Earth. I turn my gaze downwards. I see the soil 6 feet below me. 3 years ago, I decided to make a micro-meadow, to convert half of my very small lawn to a micro-meadow. 2 years ago, I was preoccupied finding seeds. When I finally found a selection of native meadow plants suitable for the shade and sun in my garden, I dispersed them with no result. Lockdown have given me lots of time to plan my contribution to terraforming. I removed the turfs to substitute the fertile soil with sand to make the land habitable for the meadow flowers. Removing the turf is difficult and discloses a vibrant world of creatures. I can't name but a few. A conglomerate of multiple species. I can recognize that they are disturbed, busy, communicating with each other, within or across the division of species constructed by humans. Lumbricus terrestris, Armadillidium vulgara, Formica rufa. They have their own social ways of organizing, collective paths to walk, often crossing each other's routes, sometimes crawling across the bodies of another creature, probably disturbed by my micro-meadow endeavors, but basically indifferent to me and my presence, preoccupied by taking their own measures to protect themselves from the removal of turf. I turn my head up. Venus is passing below Vega. I took the photo an early evening during the first COVID-19 lockdown, while standing with feet planted in the soil I was preparing for my micro-meadow. Bright, dark, cold nights enable us to pay attention to the silent movement of the celestial bodies, including our own, drawing up new dynamic vectors, lines, making connections between our bodies, sensibilities and planetary bodies, and creating moments of dissonance, disorientation, bewilderment. A planet has just been discovered, or at least assumed to exist, around Vega, adding to the 4,800 other planets that have been identified in recent years. The existence of Vega and its planet is, in a sense, fundamentally irrelevant. And let's be honest, probably no one will ever go there. And if they would, for life as such, it would be probably an immense waste of resources and time. Happy are those days when the starry sky is the map of all possible paths, ages whose paths are illuminated by the light of the stars. Everything in such ages is new and yet familiar, full of adventure and yet their own. Humans have named stars as part of their own world: Vega, Mithaq, Alcor. Self-contained worlds and reminders of the fundamental contingency of this planet and the way its matter, energy, and life is organized. An encouragement to notice the detailed strangeness of the world we are inhabiting. I sit in my garden, head oriented straight forward. It is September and I do what I have been doing all too much lately: sit in my garden. Watch the blooming micro meadow, reading, writing, editing. I've been sitting here so long every day that I have become the bearer of bees. From time to time, a bee will land on my wrist to take a rest before choosing a flower to gather its nectar, probably unaware or uninterested in that I am particularly different from the stump of my old apple tree, or perhaps one of the oyster mushrooms growing on it. My affordance is to be a landing and resting place between flower and hive. Benwit, yarrow, bees, together they form lasting entanglements that provide nurture and life for generation. With me as a decentered, peripheral body, whose virtue is to hold position and not be the source of unrest. Meadow, soil, celestial body. These might be other embodied images or devices to think with than the disembodied image of the blue dot, as well as a starting point for another way of imagining the future. I think I'll go quickly through this one, which is examples of some of these proposals for imagining a future, whether in a very positive techno-optimistic fashion, as in Benjamin Bratton's or Thomas Costigan's suggestions for terraforming or hacking the planet, or in a critical analysis. So as the compilation you probably know by Neil Brenner on planetary urbanism, where he basically describes the boundary where the globe meets the planet. And I don't want to criticize or distance myself from these, but just give you some examples to kind of relate to as imaginations of a future based on the image of the globe. But what about Urry and the mobilities approach? Certainly, we see an awareness of the borders of the globe in most of his later writings. For example, in Mobilities in 2007, he paints two futures. The first being a dark future with warlordism and climate change. And the second, a lighter, if that is the right word, a potential future with surveillance, control, and restriction on mobilities. And also in formulations such as consuming the planet to excess from 2010, he kind of hints to or points to that there is a clash between globalization and a planetary perspective. In the latter article, he also notes that contemporary notions of citizenship is intertwined with representations of the globe which occur within contemporary media. Basically, I think that in these rather gloomy analysis he presents, he's anticipating the link between the globe as the device we think with and the vanishing of the future. Most directly, I think in this formulation that I think it was first published in 2015, where I found it now, but I think that it was maybe written 10 years earlier or so, where he says that many appeals within global media are concerned to develop a sense of planetary responsibility rather than responsibility for particular locales. This is a relatively new notion and one that appears to distinguish humans from other species. However, previous citizenships have been based upon antagonism between those who are inside and those who are outside, upon identifying the non-citizens, the other, the enemy. So again, a formulation that I think that John had a not very hopeful perspective on seeing coexistence and citizenship without outside of the forces and processes of globalization. In that sense, I think that we can say that John Urry was perhaps one of the most significant registrators of the borders of the globe that emerged and became increasingly impossible to neglect in the late 20th and early 21st century, but also of how impossible it seemed to get out of that image, to transgress its boundaries, as well as the increasingly gloomy outlooks that it produced for a habitable future for humans. But I think I would like to go to the end of my presentation here and think about a bit about a publication that also came out this year, and in many ways tries to do exactly, or pick up the thread exactly where John, he left it, the discussion about the boundaries of the globe and how we can imagine a future. Planetary Social Thought by Nigel Clarke and Bruntasinski was published earlier this year and is by far the most exhaustive exploration of the themes that I'm also addressing here. And to be honest, I was actually reading the book after having proposed the theme for this event and started preparing. But reading it, I found that a lot of the literature and a lot of the perspectives that I'm also advocating here is also discussed in this book. However, I also think there are some ways to, or there are some potentials for a bit of friendly, but also perhaps critical discussion on the relationship between the planetary and the global, and the issue of coexistence in relation to it. In the book that I warmly recommend you all to read, the authors voice a lot of the same concerns that I have been doing here. Starting with an observation that we should start to imagine potential futures from the basic question: what kind of planet is it that we find ourselves? What has our planet done in the past, and what might it be capable of in the future? And closely associated with these planetary themes, we also need to ask, what kind of creature or being are we? And as I also have been advocating in my talk, they do in fact call for decentering of Homo sapiens as a natural and obvious starting point for social thought. To keep on spiraling back downwards into the depths of the earth and out into space is to remind ourselves of the contingency of our morphological and evolutionary being. But so too is it intended as a reminder that this is a planet of multiple layerings and changeable operating states, and that however damage some of our species have caused, we still dwell among an excess of possibilities. To capture these two movements, spiraling back downwards and up into space, Clarke and Bruntasinski proposed two concepts. The first being planetary multiples, which is, as I understand it, a call for acknowledging the radical contingency of the potentials for life as they unfold on this planet. It could have been otherwise, or maybe it couldn't have been at all, and the dizzying and disturbing reality of this. The second being earthly multitudes, which they define as how humans group themselves around specific engagement with the matter energy of which the earth is comprised. To simplify, and excuse me again for reducing a complex, thoughtful and important work, Clarke and Bruntasinski seem to replace the border zone between globe and planet with that of earth and planet. However, they also imply a particular perspective in which planetary multiples are being viewed through the lenses of energy, gravitation and other physical forces and processes. And earthly multitudes are, despite frequent warnings against anthropocism throughout the book and calls for more interdisciplinary engagements, registered almost solely through the lens of the human species, that is, how humans group themselves around specific engagement. I do think the book does exactly what it promises, maps out the challenge of the Anthropocene for the social sciences. But, and this will be where I will end, is thinking what futures we might have possible with an exclusively human or social perspective, or does the future horizon then gradually vanish from that perspective, as I was arguing was an increasingly prominent theme in John Urry's writings? Can we build alliances with non-human planetary creatures and take part in shared concerns with them? imagine these co-creatures as eligible to rights, giving them voice, rights to organization and habitation? Can we imagine these non-humans becoming planetary citizens together with our species? Can we envisage a future in which we are not the hosts, the ones in control, but as a perhaps most positive scenario, simply invited to the banquet and not even as a main guest? In short, and paraphrasing John Urry again, can we take futurity beyond the social, leaving the anthropocentric perspective also in our academic practice? That might be the only way to get rid of the globe as a unifying picture that fuels our imaginations about the future, to remedy the planet and enable a shared future on it. For as Urry summarized it in a very rare, colorful formulation, the sorcerer has indeed conjured up some spectacular spells for the 21st century magicians to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And that was a really inspiring presentation. I will stop the recording. I started, and we're pleased to have here the Dean of the Global School of Worcester Polytechnic Institute, who will talk about critical and disciplinary mobilities research now more than ever. I look forward to this, Mimi.
Thank you so much, Rodanti, and Adrian and the Bowman Institute and University of Leeds for the invitation to be here. I'm really happy to join you and to see many colleagues who I used to see more frequently, have not seen in some time. It's great to sort of gather in honor of thinking about John Urry's living legacy. I have to admit, I took our remit much more loosely. I do not have like a formal paper to present. I have more of a conversational reflections on some of my work and some of the inspirations that I've taken from John Urry's work. And I'll just begin by, a tribute to say that we are all, in a way, John Urry's living legacy. At least those of us who knew him, who worked with him. I first started working with him when I took up lectureship at Lancaster University in 1999. So John welcomed students and junior faculty as colleagues at Lancaster in a way that really built community. He trained so many graduate students who went on to do amazing things, including some of you here today, and continue to make contributions. In a way, he kickstarted so many research careers, so many new PhDs and new professors. And also, John built new centers like the Center for Mobilities Research, which we co-founded at Lancaster, but also then subsequent ones that went on to be founded around the world. Journals like the Mobilities Journal, and then the many others that have come since then, Applied Mobilities and Transfers and New Mobilities and Humanities journals. All inspired by his work, his example, and the research networks that he helped to build and which continue to thrive and expand around the world today. So in that sense, like the legacy is in all of these productive sites that are flourishing. And then at the same time, John also challenged the prevailing social science models in ways that seem more and more prescient and relevant today. In particular, for me, the challenge he presented to sociology, and especially to sociology in the kind of positivist empirical frameworks that are still prevalent in the United States, especially. John also, importantly, I think this is really important, he modeled good humor and humility in professional life. And it's something many of us miss. And often, academic contexts promote a kind of star system and a kind of competitiveness. And John never took part in that. and as you see in these pictures, right, he's always got that sort of slightly disheveled look and the dark kind of casual suit. John also practiced a kind of placemaking at Lancaster University, making, to be, blunt, a sort of small town, relatively obscure location, right, into a sort of academic powerhouse that was really important for those of us who were there and for the many international visitors and guests who came to Lancaster. And John engaged critical social science with the issues of the day. That is, he showed us how to jump into policy arenas and more applied work, and really kind of take what could be a very academic and theoretical enterprise and make it relevant, right, to the world now. And so those are just some of the many things I value in the legacy that he has left us. And these next couple of slides come from older presentations where I would try to convey some of the dozens of conferences and professional networks that John inspired, the Mobilities network. For a time, we had a Pan-American Mobilities network, and now, of course, we have added to this, right, the Asian Mobilities Network, Australian Mobilities Network, New Zealand. So there's many, many groups of people working across the world and then sponsoring conferences on differential mobilities, uneven mobilities, sharing mobilities. My own launch of the Center for Mobilities Research and Policy at Drexel University in 2010, John came to be the keynote speaker for this conference called Does Mobility Have a Future? Right? And 2011, we had Mobilities in Motion, New Approaches to Emergent and Future Mobilities. So futures were very much on the agenda from a very early point. And in fact, the very first conference we co-organized at Lancaster University was called Alternative Mobility Futures. So that kind of future-oriented thinking was very important throughout the development of the sort of mobilities field. Just a few of the publications, right, of dozens and dozens, hundreds that have spun off with, inspired by John's work in many ways. Journals, like, as I said, Mobilities, Applied Mobilities, Transfers, Interdisciplinary Journal of Mobility Studies, books on topics ranging from cargo mobilities to aero mobilities to mobile lives to mobile technologies of the city. And I include here my own work, Aluminum Dreams, which was published in what year was it? 2014, and Island Futures of 2020, which kind of connect to histories of materiality and coloniality. And that was an important part of my initial conversations and work with John, was bringing my background in Caribbean studies and feminist and post-colonial theory and critical race theory into conversation with mobilities research that had come out of, say, a more European critical theory tradition. So kind of bridging those different critical theory traditions. So in this work, we had argued that the new mobilities paradigm offers new tools and methods to advance policy and practice across key arenas of social change. And that's a little bit what I want to focus on, is the ways in which it promotes new sites of action by assembling actors across usually separate fields. So bringing together social sciences, arts and humanities, various kinds of academic research with public and private sectors, with planners and policymakers, architects and designers, and these much more applied fields. And sometimes that's devalued in, academic promotions and hierarchies of prestige, right? But given our challenges in the world today, I think it's so crucial that we take that turn, which I call a turn towards a kind of live sociology. And in that sense, the field has taken on problems like digital urbanism and hybrid space, post-automobility transitions, low carbon social practices, logistics and cargo mobilities, which we're all acutely aware of as right now, as all the freight, big freight ships are piling up at ports, and all the news is focusing on, will we be able to keep the system moving? John foresaw the importance of that kind of work, border governance and offshoring, really important interventions he made in the debates over offshore financial havens, right, and taxation, which has sort of grown and grown as a political issue. And of course, ethical tourism and travel. Those of you who work in the fields of tourism studies know the sort of impact of his work there. And questions around designing mobilities, which of course Ole Jensen very much picked up on in his work, but I've found it influencing other fields, other architects and designers across a broad spectrum. So in this kind of mixture of interdisciplinary and critical mobility studies, you could say different fields also kind of came into play. So while John and I were writing about the new mobilities paradigm, and we're both, you would say, situated within sociology, there were anthropologists, right, like Noel Salazar and Nina Glick-Schiller, who were writing at the same time about regimes of mobilities. There were geographers, Tim Cresswell, Pete Adey, and others talking about constellations of mobility. There were media theorists like Adriana de Souza e Silva writing about hybrid place. Jensen's work, as I mentioned, on staging mobilities and designing mobilities. Philosopher Thomas Nail's interesting work that emerged on kinopolitics and the kino scene. And also I would include, given the COVID pandemic, the important preceding work that happened around health and disease mobilities by people like Roger Keel and Tony Gatrell. So this is just to say this was like a multidisciplinary formation of different kind of conversations that were happening in different fields and in different contexts, which all intersected for me in a very exciting way within critical mobility studies. And I just wanted to return briefly to a piece I wrote in 2014 for Current Sociology, which was called The New Mobilities Paradigm for Alive Sociology. And at that point, there were many critical takes on the new mobilities paradigm, and was it a paradigm, and what did that even mean? And I wrote that mobilities research has instigated a creative recombination of existing theoretical traditions, methodological approaches, epistemologies, and even ontologies of a world constituted by relations rather than entities. And that was why we referred to it in a way as a new mobilities paradigm. It was that idea of approaching ontologies and epistemologies in this relational way through mobilities. And I argued that mobilities research ultimately could help us to reshape academic practice in and for the Anthropocene, marshaling new kinds of disciplinary hybrids, institutional bridges, political commitments, and methodological cross-fertilizations that could generate transformative approaches to the social, spatial, cultural matrix in which we move, dwell, and build a hopefully survivable future. And I think that resonates a little bit with Michael Haldrup's talk that we just heard, and trying to think about what is this context in which we live, and what is part of it, and what is the future habitability here, not just for humans, but for more than humans. And I was looking at that point at some work on kind of live methods and live sociology, inventive methods, and I was interested in the idea that mobilities research could contribute this lively, or alive sociology attentive to its own emergence. So rather than backing off the claim of a new paradigm 10 years on from its conceptualization, I pushed us to ask, could the new mobilities paradigm truly generate a paradigmatic shift in the questions we ask, the tools we use, the kinds of evidence we marshal, and the very ways in which we come to know, perceive, and act on our own social reality? And I would say for me, you know, that still embodies the kind of inspiration I took from John's work and the hope I have for it, and why I consider it a living legacy that kind of reawakens, I guess, a kind of sociological imagination, right? But one very much for our times now. And so, as I said, many fields have taken up critical mobilities thinking, and I myself have engaged with people in all of these areas listed here, from cultural geography to urban studies, to speculative design, to artistic research creation, disability studies, surveillance studies, transport and urban policy. They've all, you know, invited a conversation around this field of mobilities thinking and are kind of trying to understand it, work with it, engage with it. So I think that's really exciting, the way the field has traveled, and it has opened up these kind of bridges between different areas. So in the rest of my talk, I just want to say a little bit about how this inspired my own work on mobility justice. So mobility justice is, you know, concerned with these questions of who is able to exercise rights to mobility and who is capable or not capable of various kinds of mobilities and dwelling within particular situations. How have sovereign control and disciplinary systems, to use a kind of Foucauldian frame, historically produced differently marked bodies as unequal mobile subjects? How do local, regional, urban, national, and global systems for control over space, territory, communication, and speed produce different mobility regimes? What modes of counterpower and subversive mobilities might inform the kinds of moves that can be made to challenge these mobility regimes? And what new modes of transdisciplinary research and mobile methods might be needed to answer these questions? How does our research intersect with applications, policies, interventions, transitions, and more broadly, the political, right? And what I call the kino-political. So in writing about the politics of movement in an age of extremes, in my book, Mobility Justice, I'm brought to argue that we need this kind of critical mobilities theory now more than ever. So despite some, you know, promotion of low carbon transitions, of the COP meetings, of the IPCC reports, of all the social movements, of the Extinction Rebellion, of the new generation who are, you know, rising up against the current world as it's made, the dominant system of automobility, which John and I began our conversations around when we wrote The City in the Car in 2000, that dominant system of automobility is still expanding worldwide. Carbon capital continues to be invested in global oil drilling, like the huge drilling that's taking place off of Guyana in the Caribbean, which I study. There's natural gas fracking still expanding. There's the building of new pipeline distribution infrastructure. All of those things are still growing despite all of our the political efforts and the policy efforts. So in the face of this intractable dilemma of how to advance decarbonization, I believe the mobilities turn in the social sciences offers a multidimensional and integrated approach to think about what needs to be done and how, what the challenge is. So while the rise and the possible demise of automobility and carbon capital have been an important arena for thinking about this, the field of mobility studies goes, you know, far beyond just transportation systems, right? And that's sometimes something that has been mistaken about it. And especially now, you know, with the question of the pandemic, I think that really shows us the mobility justice challenges and the forms of power and inequality that are embedded in the governance and control of all forms of immobility, mobility, and dwelling. And in my own work, I emphasize how control over immobilities, mobilities, which I see as entangled, always occurring together, is a form of power that has deep historical roots in patriarchy, colonialism, imperialism, and racial capitalism. So an important part of the mobility studies for me was the capacity to think across scales and systems of political power at different scales. So thinking about bodies, transport, urban space, transnational mobility, and things like the logistics of planetary or global circulation. So the concept of uneven mobility was a way to think about these differential terrains for movement and experiences of moving in which there are specific embodiments, divergent affordances, routes and pathways, varied access and means of moving, and partial assemblages of connectivity and disconnectivity. In short, differential mobility capabilities at the scale of the body, right? The embodied practices. But these differentiations are literally built into urban form and suburban, exurban, extended urban through the shaping of architectures, infrastructures, as well as standards and regulations and social practices that allow some subjects to enjoy ease of movement while denying it to others. And of course, you'll hear the echoes of Bowman's influence in this kind of formulation. Uneven mobility also refers to the means or modes of movement that have different degrees of ease, comfort, flexibility, and safety, more or less friction, noise, turbulence, encounters with police, right? Arrested mobility, stopped mobility, interrupted and disrupted mobilities. And finally, it refers to these kind of what Graham and Marvin called the splintered spatial patterns and infrastructural spaces and architectures that govern and multiply such relations of mobility and immobility, speed and slowness, comfort and discomfort. So mobility justice for me is a way to think about these entangled scales. And that there is a relation between personal bodily vulnerabilities, the struggle for urban public space and shelter, the splintering of infrastructural systems, the management of unequal citizenship regimes and borders, and the uneven impacts of planetary environmental risks. But most academic research is channeled into specialist subfields. It's very difficult to get a view of that whole terrain. And for me, the new mobilities paradigm opened up this kind of post-disciplinary avenue of inquiry. And even today, if I want to apply for funding for research in the United States, it's very difficult to do it in this kind of post-disciplinary, interdisciplinary way. Everything is organized into disciplines, subfields. You study this thing and that thing, and maybe we can bring this group of researchers together with that group of researchers, but it lacks that kind of the view that mobilities research opened up of the entanglements and the relationality. So mobility justice is about more than transportation within cities. It's about these smaller micro mobilities at the bodily scale, inflected by their racializing and classed processes, gendered practices, and the social shaping of disabilities and sexualities. And at the same time, it's about the macro mobilities, right, of the rights of cross-border movement of refugees and migrants, the entangled mobilities of tourists and travelers and service workers and student mobility, and the global travel of the kinetic elites. So for me, it's this understanding of all of these issues together that is needed for the possibility of pushing beyond fossil fuel dependence, for ending the dominant system of automobility, and for remaking the carbon form in which we all live. So, the pandemic has really brought home how inequitable transport infrastructures and transport racism, especially here in the United States, have driven racially uneven exposure to the coronavirus. And that's reignited the Black Lives Matter protest movements, and this understanding that unequal mobility regimes are the basis of these inequities and disparities that are now a life and death issue. So I think it's this whole trajectory of thought is very important for thinking about how we can recover from the pandemic mobility disruption in an equitable way that does not simply entrench these inequities more deeply, and at the same time could support low carbon transitions and mobility justice. So I just want to say a little bit about how technologies of mobility and dwelling embody and lock in energy in their production, in their moment of use, in their relation to infrastructural moorings that are all predicated on unequal access to particular forms of energy, such as liquid petroleum or the energy that's embedded in our cars, roads, our buildings. And it's clear that what I call kinetic elites are monopolizing control over energy, water, mineral rights, and they're using offshore financial power to control global resources that are becoming increasingly scarce. And I think John's work helped point the finger right at the kinetic elite, at the overconsumption of energy and the hidden tax havens and so on that allowed that system to continue and allows it to continue. So uneven mobilities are both geo-ecological at their root, grounded in those energies and minerals and the way in which they circulate in a planetary system, as well as geopolitical. And we still face, I believe, the unacknowledged responsibility of high emitters of carbon dioxide for climate change, but also of the fossil fuel industry and of its supporters, right, who, even as they come up with new technological fixes, are still locking us into that existing system. And it's created this splintered provision of unequal infrastructures, deficits in housing, in food access, and in vulnerabilities to climate change. So we need to pay more attention, I would argue, to the interactions between urban infrastructure, land use, and connectivity across what we've already heard Michael refer to of Brenner's work on extended urban systems and operational landscapes, including mining, oil production, water, and energy flows, all of which feed into concentrated urban systems via transportation and logistics networks. So mobilities research enabled us to analyze such complex systems and to conceive of them in a relational and holistic way, to see how multidimensional transport-related energy transitions will have to be if they're going to have any purchase. So mobility transitions entangle micro, meso, and macro levels, as I've said, ranging from our bodily relations to the circulation of food, to street design and urban planning, and transnational and planetary mobilities. And it's this scalar fluency that will be necessary not only to address climate change and energy transitions, but also to develop the fundamental bases for mobility justice. So I'll just conclude by saying that I think John Urry foresaw many of these key issues of our era and the complex interconnections between them. The new mobilities paradigm emerged precisely to address these complex systemic disruptions and emerging trajectories of change. And the strong claim of critical mobility studies is that we must grasp complexity, turbulence, disruption, and unruly transitions through a post-disciplinary approach that engages applied and pragmatic interventions, as well as critical theory and future scenario making. And for me, this leads to a critical live social science based on kino-political commitments to both decarbonization and mobility justice. And thank you. I'll stop there, and I really look forward to hearing Jennie's talk and to the conversation that we will have to follow that.
Thank you very much, Mimi. That was really inspiring, and that was actually quite succinct as well as to what you've been doing over the last two decades, definitely. Well, I have to say that I have to dedicate more time reading your last book, because I found it really very spiritual beyond the material dimensions of inequalities and the politics of movement. And I think this is something that still needs developing in mobilities studies at a theoretical but also practical level, and connecting the two. But that's not for me to talk now. It's Jennie, who may also have PowerPoint to share with us. So Jennie, will you just talk?
Yeah, I know. I actually have it's a PDF.
Oh, all right. That's not whatever suits you.
Can you see that?
Yes.
And you can see the full slide?
Yes.
Okay.
I hope everybody does.
All right. Thank you, Rodanti, and thank you to our host at the Bauman Institute for this opportunity to honor John and to think about his ongoing legacy. Thank you for putting me in such good company with Mimi and Michael. I think our trajectory of the formality of the talks is going to go down now, because mine is even more informal, I think, than Mimi's, but hopefully it'll be okay. And thank you also to the discussants and to everyone who's joined us today. Really thrilled to be here with you. So, change the slide there. So I think maybe we're all familiar with John Urry's inclination to open his books with provocative quotes. And these two can be found in the opening pages of Sociology Beyond Societies. And I'm borrowing them to set up the idea that I want to talk about today, which is the way John mobilized a sociological imagination in his work. So as I mentioned in the abstract that I sent to Rodanti, I think that John took Baudelaire's question of moving, which Baudelaire saw as a matter for private discussion with one's own soul, and John posed it as a question for all of us, for the discipline of sociology and for society. And then I also included this quote from Lyotard because the sociological imagination, that quality of mind that C. Wright Mills identifies as the cornerstone of social scientific thinking, is attuned precisely to the way our individual selves are woven into a fabric of relations. And I think that no one captured the complexity and mobility of that fabric better than John. So when Rodanti extended the invitation to participate in this symposium, she asked us, as Michael said earlier, she asked us to think about a journey we had started with John and then maybe continued on our own. And my initial thoughts were quite literal. The tourist gaze was the whole reason I moved to England and ended up living in Lancaster for 6 years. So that was a journey that John inadvertently started, and that has sort of charted my path ever since. I really had no intention of doing a PhD in sociology. My undergraduate degree was in the humanities and my master's degree was in cultural studies. But after that, I did try sociology out. I started a master's program in applied sociology at the National University of Singapore, and sort of struggling through my class on SPSS, statistical analysis software, I decided sociology was not for me. And in fact, my favorite class in that program was an anthropology course. So I kind of figured that was probably where I belonged. So I really didn't see myself becoming a sociologist, but I did want to continue my studies. So I left Singapore and I was visiting schools in the United States and looking at PhD programs in tourism. And I had set up a meeting with Valine Smith, an anthropologist. Many of you tourism scholars will probably recognize her from her book, Hosts and Guests. And we had lunch and she listened to what I was interested in, and she told me to read John Urry's book. So I did, and that was that. And a year later, I was at Lancaster University, making my way down the spine, looking for the sociology department. And I know this is a picture of Alexander Square, not the spine, but I couldn't find a picture that of the spine as it looked when I was there. So in the, oops, sorry, wrong button. In the In the tribute that he wrote following John Urry's death, Bob Jessup referred to John as, quote, a sociologist's sociologist, as someone who knew and respected the craft, but also aimed to develop it. So from my perspective as a doctoral student and as someone who was relatively new to the discipline, John seemed intent on transcending and even dismantling disciplinary boundaries and conventions. I mean, what were we supposed to make of a book titled Sociology Beyond Society? So as new as I was to sociology, even I could guess that you couldn't have sociology without societies, right? But you can't judge a book by its cover, and I was wrong to think of that book as marking the end of sociology because, of course, what it really is, as John writes, is a manifesto for a 21st century sociology, for a sociology of mobilities. And it was, in effect, a call not to abandon the discipline's hallmark sociological imagination, but to mobilize it. And so that's what I want to reflect on today, which is how John mobilized the sociological imagination and then the profound impact that those moves have had on my work and I think on the work of all of us here. So I'm sure we're all familiar with C. Wright Mills and the sociological imagination, but just sort of as a baseline here, he defines it as the quality of mind essential to grasp the interplay of human and society, of biography and history, of self and world. He talks about it as an awareness of the intricate connection between the patterns of our own lives in the course of world history and what this connection means for the kinds of selves we are becoming and the kinds of history making in which we take part. And he says that to possess a sociological imagination is to understand the larger historical scene in terms of its meaning for the inner life and the external career of a variety of individuals. Or as I explain it to the students in my one-on-one classes, it's about understanding the interplay between the intimate stories of our own personal lives and the big stories of history, society, and the world. And so John mobilized this quality of mind in many ways, three of which I want to touch on here as they have informed my own thinking and research. And first, and perhaps most obviously, he mobilized the sociological imagination by shifting the starting point of sociological inquiry away from society in terms of fixed locations and sedentary practices and permanent institutions and bounded nation states, and focusing it instead on the diverse and intersecting mobilities and immobilities that make up society and social life. And the sociological imagination has always been, by definition, attuned to the multi-scalar nature of the social world. So it kind of requires us to constantly toggle between the large-scale dramas of history and society and the world, and then the intimate everyday stories of human and more than human lived experiences. And so in this case, John kind of recast sociology itself as a story about mobility, which then opened up new theoretical and empirical avenues for understanding how our individual lives and our intimate everyday stories are shaped in the contemporary era. And I think he had a knack for telling these big stories about mobility, about globalization and consumption, about capitalism, climate change, carbon and complexity, about nature and technology and tourism, and about immobility and inequality as well. And he did so in a way that allowed them, for people like me, to kind of fill in the intimate stories of how people's hopes and fears, their ways of traveling and dwelling and knowing, their modes of being together or staying apart, and their embodied and emotional lives were kind of playing out against and composing this mobile world that we inhabit together. I arrived at Lancaster sort of intent on studying tourism, and I had in mind this idea of studying a specific tourism destination. But thanks to the way John was framing the field of mobility studies around that time, I was actually inspired to focus my own sociological imagination more on the everyday texture of mobile sociality and mobile belonging within, but also beyond tourism. And it's that focus, like more so than strictly studying tourism, that led me to explore the everyday physical and digital mobilities of backpackers and flash packers and round the world travelers, to really look at the intimate face-to-face and platform-based encounters between couch surfers or among Airbnbers, to explore the global imaginaries and aspirations of cosmopolitan citizenship, or the world-making practices of traveling and eating and camping and volunteering, and the sensory textures of global geographies and emotional geographies and the politics of pace. And then more recently, the mobile lifestyles and future imaginaries of digital nomads and world schooling families. And I find myself constantly turning back to John's work for guidance, for help sort of seeing and understanding the broader social and economic and environmental and complex context in which the individuals I study are moving and living and being. And to be fair, to be honest, I am focusing mostly on human beings, those pesky humans. And of course, John is not my only guide in this project. So many of you here today model this mobile sociological imagination and inspire me, like Rodanti's attention to macro and micro mapping in her recent writings on the virusine, or the multiscalar theories and methods in Mimi's work, or these sort of entangled scales that she talks about, especially in mobility justice. So John also mobilized the sociological imagination across multiple temporalities, not least of all by posing the question of moving, not just in terms of historical contexts or present conditions, but as we've heard so much already today, in terms of our shared future. So in his definition of the sociological imagination, C. Wright Mills urges us to think with history, right? He wants us to understand history as a prelude to the present, and also the way individual biographies write this particular chapter of history that we're living in. And John Urry's work is also thoroughly grounded in historical contexts, sometimes even reaching past the histories of human civilization to think about glacial time and planetary histories. But John moved temporality to the heart of sociological thought in some really groundbreaking ways. And this was really, an ontological shift, or at least that's how I experienced it, where John was asking us to think beyond history as the context for or the outcome of social life, and instead to understand time and temporality and tempo and rhythm and pace, from everyday lived time to these epochal temporalities as constitutive of social life. So, for example, by centering mobility and immobility in sociological inquiry, he was pushing us, I think, to think about social life as a spatio-temporal practice. And maybe this touches back on what Rodanti was saying in the introduction about being and becoming. He writes about nature's time and instantaneous time, about shadow time and social time, and of course about the modern world-making invention of clock time. And he explores questions of time, movement, and being and becoming, especially in performing tourist places, the book he co-authored with Michael and Jonas and Jürgen Ole Bernhold. And they describe tourist places in terms of performances, rhythms, and flows, like the way tides advance and retreat in their eternal rhythms. They give us this vision of tourist places not as, quote, isolated islands of pleasure, but as hybrids bridging the realms of humans and non-humans through diverse mobilities and proximities that produce particular temporalities, quote, inscribed in circles of anticipation, performance, and remembrance. But I think John's most important contribution in this regard has been his call to think with the future. And I know we've already talked about this quite a bit so far, but I think it bears repeating. When he asks us to think with the future, I think this catalyzes what C. Wright Mills calls the task and the promise of the sociological imagination. That is, its task to reveal a critical understanding of the relationship between the self and the world, and its promise that this understanding may enable us to make a better world. And if I sound tentative, well, we'll see why. But if we could rewrite Molz's definition of the sociological imagination to capture this, it might look something like this, where what we're really studying is the interplay between humans and our biographies and the future, where we begin to understand the patterns of our own lives and the future, and what future making means for the kinds of selves that we are becoming. And that to possess a sociological imagination is to understand the future we have yet to make in terms of its meaning for the inner life and the external career of a variety of individuals. So although some of the future scenarios and the already present dystopias that John foresaw are distressing, to say the least, this incredibly vibrant scholarship that we've already seen has blossomed around his invitation for us to think about the future, and especially about alternative mobility futures, including possible tourism futures, even after the end of tourism. And perhaps the most important of these has been Mimi Scheller's work on mobility justice and regenerative tourism, thinking that's featured in her recent books, Mobility Justice and Island Futures, that we were just talking about. And in fact, I'm purposefully borrowing this language of the future we have yet to make from a recent social justice summit that Mimi's institution organized to illustrate how this temporal move ripples out into mobilities thinking. And then because Rodanti asked us to reflect on the this journey that we've continued to take, I'll also note that the question of the future and sort of the world-making power of future stories was an inspiration in my recent book, The World is Our Classroom, too. So this is a book about world schoolers, families who take their children out of conventional school settings and educate them while traveling the world. And in my analysis, I describe how the specter of an uncertain future informs this mobile lifestyle. And so the future is a prism through which families make a series of lifestyle choices that they hope will help their children become flexible, portable selves and global citizens who can adapt to anything. So from the big life decision to take their families on the road to the mundane and everyday practices of eating new foods or coping with homesickness or playing video games online with friends, or parents, coaxing kids to pick up another language or learn how to make their way through an airport or just generally be entrepreneurial. So it's that kind of knot of anxiety and aspiration about the future that frames their mobility, not just as a lifestyle choice, but as a lifestyle strategy. But then in the conclusion to the book, I worry about what appears to be a highly individualized version of the future, right? Preparing my kid for the future that seems to preclude or maybe overshadow a more collective, sustainable, and just alternative mobility future for all of us. And here my critique and my hope draw quite explicitly on Mimi's work on mobility justice, but it's also deeply informed by the way John kind of trained my sociological imagination on the future. And then finally, as we've mentioned earlier, John also mobilized the sociological imagination across disciplines. So I remember sitting in John's office one day talking, I think we were talking about some of the books that he was reading or speed reading, as he would do at the time. And I was asking him if he had plans to write another book about tourism. And he's like, no, too many other new ideas, too many new things to explore to spend time on something that he'd already done. So but thank goodness and thank Jonas that we did get a third edition of the Tourist Gaze though. But in his tribute, Bob Jessup says that John was, quote, a restless intellectual spirit, which is quite true. In fact, that tribute was actually titled More Than a Sociologist, and that more is quite significant. So perhaps a better way of describing John's style of thought isn't in terms of mobilizing the sociological imagination, but as mobilizing a more than sociological imagination. As Mimi pointed out in her talk, John drew on scholarship and made connections with scholars from every corner of knowledge. And he collaborated with people beyond academia as well, and all around the world. His bibliographies and his research networks included sociologists, but also anthropologists, geographers, like lots of geographers, historians, scientists. I kind of wish I could pull Mimi's slide up right here with the list of all the different fields that John engaged with. So this way of thinking across disciplines is evident in his own body of work, of course, but I mean, it lives on in the intellectual communities like this one who continue to be inspired by his theories, and in the scholarship we see published in Mobilities and the other journals that, that his work inspired. So for someone like me who wasn't sure about being a sociologist in the first place, John's interdisciplinary approach, or post-disciplinary or multidisciplinary, or whatever the apt term is, to me, that was really liberating. And of course, I was beyond lucky to be supervised in my PhD research by Mimi Scheller and Anne-Marie Fortier, both of whom championed this interdisciplinary approach as well. And it really wasn't until later, I think I was a bit sheltered at Lancaster, but it was later when I was an assistant professor of sociology on the tenure track, and as Mimi pointed out, trying to apply for grants, that I first felt the pressure to kind of color within the disciplinary lines, you know, to teach Mills and the sociological canon, to publish in the right journals in the field. But I've never been able to stay in a disciplinary lane, not in my research and not in my teaching. One of the things I learned from watching John, and something that has really guided me, was that it's far more important and maybe more fulfilling to be curious than to be a sociologist. Of course, the other lesson that he modeled was how to be both. And so by using sociology as a home base from which to launch his intellectually restless spirit into the world. So, so that's my talk, but I do have one last idea I want to pose. So I know it may seem kind of old school to be talking about the sociological imagination and C. Wright Mills's writings from the 1950s, but it's largely John's fault that I'm a sociologist at all, at least according to the title on my office door, which means he's also partly to blame for the fact that I've been teaching Sociology 101 to first-year undergraduate students practically nonstop for the last 15 years. So C. Wright Mills is never far from my mind. And this brings me to a final topic I'd like to pose to this community, which is something that is a constant challenge for me, which is how to bring this question of moving into our teaching, and especially teaching with undergraduate students. I think for many of us, John's impact was not just through his writing, but through our relationships with him as a teacher and a mentor. And I think Mimi captured that quite aptly. So in light of that, how can we incorporate this question of moving into our own teaching and mentoring, both within and beyond the classroom? How can we use it to disrupt the sociological canon and inspire our students to imagine sociologically in new ways, and to join us in our own journeys of imagining alternative mobility futures? So I don't know if that's a topic for discussion here, or maybe an idea for a subsequent conversation, but I will look forward to hearing your thoughts. And many, many thanks for your attention.